Senator Levin enters the threshold of the door, I'd like you guys to stand and applaud, please. Welcome, Senator Levin. As you just witnessed, you are at the greatest middle school in the state of Michigan. This is an incredible group of young people, and they are engineered every day by an incredible teaching staff. So we're glad that you're here. We're excited to hear what you have to teach us. Before we begin, though, I just wanted to note to the Senator, thank you to, again, AJ and Max for their wonderful greeting. Great job, young men. And I know that they mentioned to you that we are becoming an international baccalaureate school, the first school north of actually Midland to attain that status. So I'm very proud of the staff and the students for moving in that direction, Senator. It's great. With no further ado, the reason that you're here is to teach these young people what you have, the wisdom that you've seen over the years. And to kick things off is going to be the teacher that's responsible for bringing you here. Big round of applause for Mr. Macaluso.
Thank you, CMS and parents, community members. I appreciate you guys being here for this great event. Just a story about how we got here, and I will be extremely brief. Back in the fall of the school year, Mrs. Lillen and I sat down and we wrote a lot of letters. We wrote a lot of letters for our Michigan Youth Government Program. A program that's grown from 5 students just a few years ago, it seems, to over 60 now. Michigan Youth Government's a program that takes place in Lansing where students, middle school students and high school students in the other program go to Lansing, they become senators, they become representatives, and they learn the process of how bills become laws. In addition to that, they also do debate and political compromise. It challenges students in the legislative debate process, and what I'd like to do is recognize those youth government students, and the reason that Senator Levin has come here to talk to us today. Michigan Youth Government students could stand, and teachers would give a round of applause. Thank you very much. So back in the fall, I wrote a letter that Senator Levin indicated wanting to help and not having time in his busy schedule, imagine that, to visit us in northern Michigan here. But I was recently contacted by his aide, Mr. Schneider, and he told me that the senator had time in his schedule to meet with us. And after I put myself back on the chair I had fallen off of, we are very honored to have him with us here today. So to introduce the senator. Senator Levin is the senior senator from the U.S. Senator from Michigan, serving since 1979, and has served longer than any U.S. senator from the state of Michigan. He is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Armed Services, which oversees our national defense system, and has become one of our nation's most respected leaders on national security. He is named by Time Magazine as one of America's 10 best senators, and as a part of the Great Lakes Task Force, he has fought to protect our signature of natural resource, our wonderful Great Lakes. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Carl Levin.
Thank you so much for that, both of you, for great introductions and for having such a great middle school here. You said it's the greatest school in the country, greatest middle school in the country. And I'm sure you're either one or two, because one of my kids is in middle school, so I can't say you're the best. I know you're a great middle school because you got great teachers, and you've got great staff, administrators, principals, and so forth, great parents, because they make a huge difference in all of our lives, not just in the ways we usually think of, but also in terms of teaching. And when you were younger, reading to you probably, if you were lucky to have a parent or brother or sister who would read to you, it makes all the difference in the world. My parents taught me that teachers belong on pedestals. We felt in my family that some of the most important people in our lives, in addition to our family, were people who taught us, because they could inspire us, they could change our lives, they could open up our minds to subjects, to ideas which could have a huge impact on our lives. And so that's what my parents taught me, is that teachers were really, really important to us. And they're not the best paid folks in the world, but they have rewards other than financial rewards just by watching the young people grow and learn and get inspired by various things that you can be exposed to. You never know what it is. I just was at a dinner, my wife and I, with John Glenn, who was our first astronaut to circle the globe. And he talked about the importance of a teacher in his life, how that changed his whole orientation. It opened him up to flying when he was a young boy and to spacecraft. You never know what the subject is. It could be someone who could teach you a subject that you never thought you had an interest in. And all of a sudden, the spark hits and you then become interested in a particular subject. I also was taught when I went to law school, went to college, people said, well, what subjects are you interested in? I was taught to say, well, whatever the best teachers teach, that's what I'm interested in. Because it's not just what you learn in the subject matter, but it's what teachers can inspire you to, and that can be any subject. So we were taught when I got older to pick not the subject of the course, but the teacher of the course when I went to college and to law school, because sometimes it's said that education is what you learn education is what remains after you forgot everything that you learned, because that's a process, that's a way of thinking, it's an open mind. I was just up at Mackinac excuse me. I was just up at Mackinac yesterday for a conference. They were talking about Michigan, the future of Michigan, in this case of Southeast Michigan, and talking about innovation and how important it is that Americans be innovative, that we discover, that we change things, that we work to make things work better, that we get around problems, that we meet challenges, that if we see a barrier and we can't cross it, we figure out a way to go around it. And there was a political scientist, I guess, a guy who came over from France almost 200 years ago. His name was de Tocqueville. And he was a famous writer. It was back in the 1830s, I believe, and he wrote about America. And he went west in America. What he then and everyone then thought was the western part of America, which was all the way to Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Missouri. That was the West. And what he talked about was innovation in America. That's one of the things that really struck him, is innovation. How people in America, with their open minds and their freedom to think, not being dictated to by others, by their government, that they were open-minded and that they could create, they could be entrepreneurial. But he used the word innovative constantly in his writing about America. And one of these days, if you haven't already been exposed to de Tocqueville, you realize that he was a very perceptive guy. He was a Frenchman. He was an aristocrat. He was stunned by democracy here, by the egalitarian system we had. People felt they were equal. There were no people that were better than the other people, no matter what the occupation of a particular person was, that people felt that they were equal to others. There were no higher classes, lower classes. There were people who were Americans. And that really stunned him. But what also struck him was the openness of this society, the freedom to think, to differ, to debate. And that was something that he talked about and wrote about in his book. I don't know if this mic is working right. I hear kind of an echo or a hum. Is this okay? Is this working okay? By the way, Gabe Schneider is right over here. He's probably been following me around now for how many years, but more important, he's my regional rep in Traverse City, where we have an office, and he's a father for the second time. He's got a month old second kid who keeps him up at night, so if he looks really haggard, it's not because I drive him so hard, it's because he's got a new baby in the family. Talking about babies, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then about my work, and then open it up to you. I've been in the Senate for 34 years, as was said, so I'm on my 6th term. Senators are elected to 6-year terms, unlike members of Congress, as we say, are members of the House of Representatives who are elected for 2 years. Every state, as you all know, has 2 senators. There's no difference how big or small a state you are. Now, this is one of the great compromises of the Constitution. When our country was formed, there was a huge debate as to how much power the federal government should have, how much power should be left in the states, how the states should be represented in Congress. And they decided to have 2 houses of Congress, one a Senate, where each state got 2 senators, no matter how big a population or how small. Whether you're a state now that has less than 1 million, like Wyoming, or whether you've got 35 million like California, you get 2 senators. Of course, the House of Representatives is by population, so their 435 members are divided almost exactly evenly, but pretty close to evenly by population. My brother, by the way, is a congressman. He represents parts of 2 counties near Detroit, Macomb County and Oakland County. I represent, as does Debbie Stabenow, the other senator, the entire state. It's an incredibly big state. The distance in the state from one end to the other shocks my colleagues when I tell them that the distance between Detroit and the western end of the Upper Peninsula is further than it is from Detroit to Washington. They are amazed when they hear that. They have to look at a map to check me out. So it's a large state, and so I cover a lot of territory. I do a lot of traveling. My home, though, is in Detroit, where my wife and I live. We live downtown near the 2 new stadiums, where the Lions are supposed to play, where the Tigers do play. And we lived there since I was elected to the Senate back in 1978. We also have a house in Washington. We have 3 daughters, 3 sons-in-law, and 6 grandchildren. Each of our daughters has 2 children. My wife and I have been married for 50 years, almost 51 years now. As has been mentioned, I'm chairman of the Armed Services Committee, which means I have a special responsibility to, with my colleagues, adopt a bill each year called the Defense Authorization Bill. We authorize the number of troops, the pay of our troops, the benefits, the health care for them and their families, the weapons systems, the training, anything to do basically with the military, whether it's active duty or guard or reserve forces, is authorized by our committees. Armed Services Committees in the Senate, where I chair, and John McCain, the senior Republican who sits next to me. We work together. There's a lot of discussion about Congress not working together on a bipartisan basis, and that's too true. But on the Armed Services Committee, we work together very closely. We don't always agree. There's disagreements, but we work those out in a very civil way, and we come up with a bill where we almost every year all vote for it. A couple of days ago now, I guess what is today, Wednesday? So last Thursday we adopted our annual bill in committee, and it was for the last 50 years we've adopted a bill every year. It's a long process, complicated process, involving hundreds and hundreds of pages. We've got a large staff to work on it, but it was a unanimous vote that we approved the Defense Authorization Bill for this year. The most important thing to remember about the Senate, if you don't remember anything else, is that the Senate does not operate by majority rule. It's the only legislative body in the world where the majority does not meeting. We have a filibuster rule that requires that if there's opposition to a bill, that it takes 60 votes, 60 out of 100 senators, 60 votes to end the debate on a bill, so that 41 senators can actually stop passage of anything. But more importantly, it's a few senators that can threaten to filibuster. And it's the threat of the filibuster which is the problem. And it's why, more than ever, we have so much gridlock in the Senate, because we have a few senators, new senators particularly, who basically don't believe in compromise. They've taken a position which is very rigid, very ideologically driven, and they just don't believe that they are there to give up some things in order to get some things. And if everyone took that position, you couldn't have government. If everyone took the position they weren't going to vote for anything unless they got their way totally, you couldn't function. And so since we have the rule allowing unlimited debate or filibuster, and allow people to threaten to do that until 60 people vote to shut them up, and because it takes us about a week to go through that process of ending the filibuster, a few senators, more than ever, through a threat of a filibuster, have really been able to gridlock much of our energies, much of our effort, and much of our accomplishment. That doesn't mean we don't get things done. We do, but it's much more difficult because of the actions of a few senators who threaten every bill unless they get their way on something, unless they get to control the agenda, unless they get to offer a particular bill that they want, that they're going to filibuster whatever it is that the majority leader wants to bring before the Senate. So we do get some things done. I don't want to be totally gloomy about this. We'll pass our defense authorization bill, but a lot of things we should get done are tied up for far too long. And as a result, Washington is perceived, and the Senate is perceived with some accuracy as being in a place which is tied up, and now it's too much of the time. That's one other thing that I'm very deeply involved in is what's called a permanent subcommittee on investigations, where I'm also chairman. And this is something which has been in the news a great deal because we have the power to investigate anything that we want to investigate where the government is falling short of what it should be doing, is wasted money, is violating people's rights, whatever it is, that we're allowed to investigate a activity or a lack of activity on the part of any government agency. It's a unique subcommittee. There's only one like it in the Senate, which has broad investigating powers. We recently looked into the financial collapse, had some very strong hearings, very widely covered hearings, publicized hearings on Wall Street. Some of you may have caught some of the TV on it or some of the coverage on it. We had a famous hearing on Goldman Sachs, one of the big Wall Street firms, which basically engaged in some pretty serious conflicts of interest where they worked against their own clients' interest. We had something crop up last week with Facebook where there may be something similar which happened. A whole lot of folks who wanted to buy that stock. One of the big banks that was handling that sale of Facebook stock actually advised some of their clients to be more careful. Facebook wasn't worth as much as was being touted. And so some of their bigger clients were kind of warned off against buying that stock, but some of their smaller clients, the little people, were not. And the question then came up, can a bank treat their clients differently? If you tell a big shot, hey, be careful, but tell a little person, go ahead and buy that stock. So that's the kind of activity which we can investigate, and we don't know yet whether we would do that or not in this case. But we have that power in the permanent subcommittee on investigations to engage in these kind of investigations, have very strong subpoena power of the chairman, and the chairman of that subcommittee can sign subpoenas very easily to force witnesses to come before us and testify under oath. So those are some of the things that I've been engaged in over the years, and let me stop there and open it up to questions, if that's all right.
This is Grant, everyone. Grant's got a question.
Mr. Senator, what exactly is your role in our government?
As one of 100 senators, we voted on all the bills that come before us. The Senate has slightly different functions than the House of Representatives. Both of us have to adopt the same bill, actually physically the same piece of paper, before it becomes law, and then it only becomes law if the President signs it. So if the President vetoes it, then we would have to vote on whether to override. But the most important thing we do is vote on bills. Secondly, the Senate votes on nominations, so that we vote on ambassadors, we vote on cabinet officers, we vote on judges, we vote on other certain high-level officials whether to confirm nominations. So most importantly, I, along with my 99 colleagues, vote on whether to adopt legislation in the budget of the United States. We also, as I mentioned, I'm chairman of two committees. One is the full committee, the Armed Services Committee. The other one is the permanent subcommittee on investigations. The Armed Services Committee takes up probably 2/3 of my time. The other subcommittee takes up probably 1/3 of my time in terms of committee work. But in addition to that, we have constituent service. So if a veteran comes into the office and says he can't get action from the Veterans Administration, or somebody comes and calls or emails and says they can't get a passport issue, whatever the issue is with a federal agent, we're there to cover it. And so what happens is Gabe and the guy who works with him and my other regional offices around the state, we've got one office in the Upper Peninsula, in Escanaba, we have an office in Saginaw, an office in Grand Rapids, an office in Warren, an office in Detroit, and I left out one. Our offices work with people around the state to try to cut through red tape and get things done with federal agencies if they're slow or if they haven't acted properly. So that's a very important part of our work. There's not a day that passes where we don't get lots of phone calls, personal visits into these regional offices. Again, Traverse City being closest. We also answer our emails, and answer mail, snail mail. We get lots of that, lots of phone calls. And so we've got people who just spend full time answering those kind of inquiries. People who want information about various things, and who need to be responded to. Spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time studying. The issues are extremely complex in many cases. Tax laws are very complex. I'm involved in a lot of military issues, defense issues. What do we do in Afghanistan? What do we do in Iraq? We're now out of Iraq, so that's not really an issue any longer. But what do we do with Syria? Should we get involved in Syria? If so, under what conditions? So I get involved in reading, and studying, and thinking a lot about the issues which I have to deal with. So I think that's kind of covers it pretty much, I hope.
Jeffrey.
All right, Senator, are you good friends with any of the presidents that you've served with?
The way you would call someone a good friend, probably here, the answer is no, not in that sense. Do I know the senators, the presidents? The answer would be yes. Do I have work with presidents? presidents? The answer is yes. Probably of all the presidents, I would have been closest would be Bill Clinton of all the presidents. And my good friend, I probably, if I were introducing him here, I would say, now my good friend, Bill Clinton. But the way you have good friends, I probably would not give him that designation and title. But I know them all and work with them all. Politicians sometimes exaggerate a lot and say, now my dear friend and now my good friend. Sometimes it can be your worst enemy, but you still say it's none of the presidents were my worst enemy.
Senator, what's your favorite part about being a senator from Michigan?
What's my favorite thing besides meeting with kids? That's political stuff. I'd say it's a variety. My favorite thing about being a senator would be the diversity, the variety of things that I got to deal with. Everything from how do we deal with Afghanistan now? I just took my 8th trip perhaps to Afghanistan, came back a couple of weeks ago. To how do we make sure that the Great Lakes are here and improved and cleaned up and protected forever for your great-grandkids. But it's everything in between. It's just complicated issues on the tax code, issues involving all kinds of education issues. How do we promote higher education? What do we do for what we call K-12, which means all the way up to high school? It's the priorities for the budget. We struggle over those issues. How much do we spend of our federal taxpayer dollars for highways? How many do we spend for education? How much do we spend for cleanup of the environment? How much do we do for defense? I mean, we've got this huge variety of issues which really keeps life fascinating. So I would say probably more than anything else it would be just the variety of issues that we have to understand and study and deal with.
Senator, how much pressure do you have upon your shoulders most of the time?
Well, my wife says that I'm not standing up very straight these days, so there must be some pressure on there. I don't view it as a lot of pressure myself, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm comfortable with myself. Number two, I don't worry too much about getting reelected, so I don't worry that really is not what drives me. What does obviously matter to me is trying to reach the right decision on issues. If I do, then I feel that that's fine. So I don't get the kind of pressure that some of my colleagues get about whether or not a vote will help them or hurt them in their reelection, because I don't feel that that's my focus. It ought to be what I think after listening to people and studying the issues best for my state. Even though it may not be popular in my state, there's some things I voted for which are not particularly popular, but as long as I feel after listening to folks and considering the pros and cons of issues that what I vote for or do is the right thing for the people of Michigan, then I'm comfortable and I can sleep at night. That's the test as far as I'm concerned. So I don't do that kind of pressure. I don't worry about the election pressure. I got a great staff. That makes all the difference in the world in terms of lack of pressure on me or on my shoulders. I've got a terrific staff around Michigan and Washington that are able to really meet all of my needs in terms of information, getting me places on time. I was 10 minutes late, so obviously we fell short here today. But so I got a great staff. I also, in terms of family, this is critically important. If you're going to get into public life, you really need the family to support you. My family has been terrific. They've always supported. In fact, if you don't have the support of your family, I would advise against doing elective work at least. So I don't have pressure from that direction. If you don't have a good family life, a good solid family that is supportive, it would be pressure. Since I have I'm blessed to have a great family, that I don't have pressure from that direction. So I think I'm just lucky I don't feel a lot of pressure on my shoulders from any direction, actually.
Thank you.
Senator, what are you doing to help the school budget crisis in Michigan?
The federal budget, Mr. President, the federal role, I guess, in education, what are we doing to help the school budgets here in Michigan? The federal government provides less than half of the funding, far less than half, for our public schools and our colleges. But we do have an important role. We provide funding, the main part of our funding is called Title I funding, and so that plus other parts of the education budget do support schools here in Elks Rapids and around the state. The way in which we support education in Washington is by our decision as to how much of our federal budget will go to education. And this is a very important part of our work. How do we divide up the federal budget? It's between the various federal programs, whether it's defense, whether it's highways, whether it's health care, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. All of these involve federal dollars and 100 other programs on top of that. So the way in which I support education is to put education as one of my very top priorities. There's nothing probably more important than education as far as I'm concerned. That's the way I was raised. I think my parents taught me, they would never borrow from me. We were borrowing from you kids right now in terms of our deficits. My parents would never borrow from me, except for one thing. They would borrow money for education, not necessarily for me, but from someone. That was number one. Worth borrowing money from. Very few other things. Our health, maybe. But education is such a high priority that when I decide how do we divide the federal budget, education takes it at the very top of it. So that is the way I support education. But again, most of the funding is local. Most of the funding that comes for education comes from property tax, comes from the state budget, but a significant part does come from Washington, and hopefully we put education as a top priority.
Sabrina, do you just want to stand and read yours out loud?
Senator, why did you decide to go into politics, and do you recommend that we go into them?
I recommend that people go into public service, first of all, whatever it is, whether it's elected work or non-elected work. I think everyone has a responsibility to their community to do something for their community, some form of public service. Doesn't have to be politics at all. It could be teaching, it could be being a firefighter, it could be working on raising funds for the parks, whatever it is. I think everyone has that responsibility to their community. So in that sense, public service really is a responsibility for all of us. In terms of politics, if you're interested in it, you should go for it. If you're not interested in it, it's like anything else. You should do something that you are interested in. You should follow your own star, and if your star is political life, then go for it. It's very, very rewarding. It's not particularly rewarding financially. There's other things that are more rewarding financially, but in terms of the other things that are rewarding in life besides money, it could be, in my case, has been extremely rewarding. What got me into public service was my parents. I was raised during the Roosevelt years, Franklin Roosevelt years. It was a big subject in my house. My parents strongly believed in what Roosevelt was doing in terms of helping average folks cope with the getting jobs for people, getting health care for people, getting education for people, getting Social Security for our seniors. These were things which were important in my house and the subject of discussion at the dinner table. So I would say more than anything else, it would be my parents who got me interested in public service. They were great Democrats. I'm a Democrat. And of course, I think that their political philosophy was something which really connected them and their children, my brother, my sister, and me, to trying to make a difference in the lives of average folks. They loved Harry Truman because he fought for average people. But Harry Truman called the little guy. But what he meant by the little guy was not just a guy, but gals and guys, and also people who were just of average needs, middle income needs, working people. That's what motivated Truman, as it did Roosevelt. And that's what motivated my parents, and they passed that along to me.
Thank you, audience, for representing the greatest middle school in the state of Michigan up to this point in time. You guys are doing great. Keep it up. Let's do this. Let's open it up to, let's take 3 questions from the audience. 3 questions. Audience members, any other questions that you have? Misty, yes. Mrs. Youngson.
I'm sorry, you serve on the board of...
The Office of Resource Network.
Okay. Actually, we have a bill that colleague of mine, Kirsten Gillibrand, who's a senator from New York, has introduced, and we are going to put some real focus on that issue. We're going to, there's actually probably a more complex issue than you were even aware of, so I'm going to answer it more directly and straightforwardly, which is that I'm very much in favor of the military doing a much better job with autistic children than they are now. We actually have a provision in our bill, which Senator Gillibrand introduced, which will move the military exactly in the directions you're talking about.
Is that HR?
It's not an HR. HR is a House of Representatives bill, but it's a sit, and I can get you the language. As a matter of fact, if you'll give Gabe your email address or your address, we will send you the language from the bill that I made reference to before. The defense authorization bill, we just put language in there, which may or may not be similar to the House bill. I'm not familiar with that, but I am familiar with the Senate language. We will send it to you. Okay, give Dave your address.
Thank you. Other questions? Peyton?
My question, Senator, is what is the Senator's, what is their stand on the economy's,
What's the stand on the economy in terms of?
In terms of how the debt crisis?
Okay, in terms of the debt.
Is that one of the higher priorities?
Okay, the question is in terms of the debt crisis, we have a large national debt, which is the total of all of the money that we have borrowed each year. If our budget is in deficit, you add up all those deficits each year, and that gets you to the national debt, which is a major problem. This is one of the great dividing issues of our time. And here's where the division is. Most of us feel we've got to stop adding to the debt and start reducing the debt. Okay? I think most of us feel that. Where there's a difference is how to do that. Most Democrats believe that we've got to reduce our deficits in 2 ways. One, reduce spending, but the other way is to raise revenues. Most Republicans have signed an oath saying they're not going to raise any revenues. Every president that I've worked with who has been interested in deficit reduction has had a balance between additional revenues and spending cuts. Ronald Reagan, who was no big spender, 3 times had a deficit reduction program, which was adopted. Each of those times, there was a balance of additional revenues and less spending. The same thing was true with the first President Bush. The same thing was true with President Clinton. The second President Bush didn't do any deficit reduction. He should have, by the way. We should have at least paid for the wars we were in. That's not your question. President Obama wants to do it with a balance, a combination of spending less, cutting spending, but also raising revenue. If you're really interested in deficit reduction, you cannot do it just by cutting spending. There's no way you can significantly do it. Even the most drastic proposals to cut spending do not end deficit spending because they don't include revenues. Now, how do you include revenues? What am I talking about? What kind of taxes am I talking about? First, upper income folks have done very well. The only people in this country who have done well financially are the upper 1%, making over $250,000, that have increased their share of national income from 10% to 25% in the last few decades. I would restore or increase, however you want to frame it, the higher tax rate for upper income people. 1% of the public, $250,000 and above, raises, believe it or not, a lot of money because they have a big share of the national income. I would also close what are called tax loopholes. We talked a minute ago about Facebook. We talked about the sale of Facebook shares. Well, there's what's called a stock option loophole, which is used by Facebook and other corporations to avoid paying taxes. Facebook, the corporation, will get a $16 billion tax deduction. Facebook, although it's very, very profitable, will not pay the income taxes for at least 10 years because of this loophole in the law. Now, there's a lot of other ones, and I won't go into more because they get very technical unless you got a computer, paper, and pencil. It's not so easy to follow, but I can just tell you this. The big issue that you raise is whether or not we not just cut spending, which we've got to do and are doing, but whether we also raise revenues, and if so, how do you raise revenues? I think we need to do both if we're serious about deficit reduction, which is your question.
One more question. I'd like it to come from the Youth and Government group here. Kate.
Senator, what's your stand on conservation of water in the Great Lakes?
Well, on the conservation of water and the Great Lakes in general, it's a passion of mine. It's, one of the early things that I did was the Great Lakes Protection Act, which limits the amount of bad stuff that you get into the lakes from our various industries. We put a real lid on and reduced dramatically what the various states would put into the Great Lakes. Secondly, we just passed the law, which was also the one I introduced, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The President has put about $300 million into this year's budget for Great Lakes restoration, conservation, preservation, and I very much favor that involved on the Senate side with 2 major Great Lakes initiatives and protection acts that exist. So you folks live on the Great Lakes. I hope you know how blessed you are, how lucky you are, and how obligated you are to hand that down to your children and grandchildren, even better than they are now. And they are fabulous. The world is jealous of us. I'll end with a little anecdote here. There was a Korean firm that was looking around the world as to where they would open up a new factory. They decided to build their factory down further south from here, between around Holland, Michigan. And the reason they did they finally decided to go there instead of some other part of the United States or some other part of the world, just because they want to be here in the Great Lakes. Look at a map of the globe from space. You can see the Great Lakes from space. We have the world's greatest fresh water, and we are obligated to protect it and to leave it even better than we found it. So I'm glad you asked about it. Congratulations, by the way. Your interest in government is really great. It's appreciated by those of us that are in government, that we have students that really take an interest in government. And thank you for that. Thank you for being such a great middle school.
Mr. Macaluso, the rest of the teachers and I know even Senator Levin, thank you, audience. You've been a great audience. We're going to wrap up, move toward wrapping up now. Andrew Eyes up here. Great job again, everyone. Senator Levin, if you feel at liberty to share this with us, could you tell us about your personal family? Or is that something, or would you rather not?
No.
Okay, no.
As I mentioned, I've been married 50 years, going on 51. I have three daughters, 3 sons-in-law, 6 grandchildren. My brother is a member of the House of Representatives, and we lost our sister about 8 years ago now. She was the older sister. We've got all kinds of cousins. I won't get into them. But we've got a large family. We have family reunions. We're a very close family, by the way. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's been a real source of support. There just is no substitute for having a loving and supportive family. Those of us that are blessed to have a family like that really understand the importance. It breaks my heart, frankly, when I see a brother that doesn't talk to another brother or sister that isn't talking to a brother, whatever. Parents, children that are separated. And we see this sometimes, not in my family, luckily, but we see it with friends. It can happen for lots of reasons, that there's estrangement within a family. And if you're part of a close family, you realize just how important that is to you. It's really heartbreaking for those who don't have that blessing. So that's a kind of a short answer.
We have a member of our Cherryland Middle School family who has a family member that is a former politician. Jacob Elsenheimer, would you stand, please? Jacob Elsenheimer is the son of Kevin, former Representative Kevin Elsenheimer.
Lansing, right, of course. You're going to say the son or grandson?
Son.
Son?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you going into politics?
I've gotten used to it over the years, but I don't know.
Or did you have your fill?
Huh?
Or did you have your fill of politics, being the son of a politician?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, whatever it is. Put him on the spot. Yeah. Okay, put it anyway, except their own reason.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. And, yes. And Mr. Macaluso would like to present.
Senator Levin, I just want to present you with a Youth of Government t-shirt. You can see we're sporting a few of them out here just as a thanks for coming out and talking to our government group and our whole school. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Comes to see you in Washington, D.C. Here's a picture of last year's with the wonderful eighth grade right in front of us here. And Mrs. Schaefer, tell the Senator again when we will be in Washington, D.C. this year.
Our annual Washington, D.C. trip is the 3rd week of August.
Well, I will not be in Washington 3rd week of August. We're out unless something brings us back. But I noticed you got a double extra large t-shirt. My wife keeps telling me I'm putting on weight. I'll tell you.
Thanks. Yes. One more huge round of applause for the Senator.
This youth of government.
get in a little bit more for me to fit you in? Thank you.
Can we see Senator Levin in there?
See him right in the middle. Okay, eyes on me. I'm going to take several shots. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Beautiful.